This is something that I've wanted to talk about for a very long time. It's something that I think a lot of people who are very online and are comic fans and who have done the digging over the years probably know about. Long rumor turned fact turned official by DC in 2020. We are talking about Alan Moore's event that never was, Twilight of the Superheroes. Okay. So in 1987, Alan Moore was on top of the comics industry. Watchmen was, of course, a huge success, and it wrapped in October of that year. Moore was riding high on that success. We know that things between Moore and DC became sour after it was clear that he would never get the rights to Watchmen characters, and that even though DC had sold Moore and Gibbons on the idea that eventually they would get these rights back and they would reap all these benefits and things like that, that DC never intended to let Watchmen go out of print. And so they sort of tricked him, at least from his perspective, and he said he would never work with them anymore after he realized that his relationship with them would officially end in 99. But before things fell apart, Alan Moore was working on a project for DC that could be viewed as the spiritual successor for Watchmen. I have never seen anyone say that before about this. That's what I am saying. And I believe that. And we'll talk about why. In 1995, the 39-page proposal for this project mysteriously popped up on the internet, and it would go on to be a battleground for Moore and DC, and it would show audiences a peek at what they would never actually get. We're talking about Alan Moore's Twilight of the Superheroes, the greatest superhero story never told. Now, Alan Moore talks a lot about his philosophy on superheroes, what he thinks a good crossover is, and many, many, many other things. And I think as we talk about this, it's important to break down the mindset of Alan Moore and where he's coming from. This is a project that we will be doing over multiple weeks, the next few weeks at least. And so we're going to talk about this in stages. And today, I really want to go over what Alan Moore was thinking when he created his pitch and sent it off to DC, why he did it, what inspired it, who inspired it, and what his hopes were for Twilight of the Superheroes. Before we start, do either one of you, Kayla or Tyler, have a familiarity with this at all?
Nope. Not at all.
Just whispers. Yeah. Early internet forum stuff, that's all.
I feel like I've heard of Twilight of the blank, but that could be Twilight of the Gods.
It is, yeah.
Versus this, like maybe I've heard of superheroes, maybe not. But I've definitely, I'm familiar with that title to a certain degree.
Twilight of the Gods is essentially what Ragnarok is. Like that's basically what that means. And so this is taking that idea, that concept, and then of course applying it to superheroes. I think for most people, it has been whispers and rumors. There was a time when this was not even accessible and it was difficult to find, and it really is just this proposal. People have done fan art over the years and things like that, but there's not anything more than this that is an official thing.
What year was it pitched?
This was pitched in 97.
97.
Or I'm sorry, 87. Jesus, 87. 97. My God. By 97, I think Alan Moore was trying to figure out how to curse the brass at DC Comics.
Figure it out by God. Yeah, it's been working ever since.
So, I want to start with what it is, because I think a lot of people don't even have any familiarity about what this would have been, what the plan was, and things like that. So, Twilight of the Gods would have been the event that followed Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it would have seen a Rip Hunter and John Constantine from the future returning to that present DC. So DC's present in 1980, whatever, or early 90s, whenever this would have come out, to warn the heroes about the future and try to prevent it from occurring. That future is 30 years from the present, when the world is now ruled by different superhero dynasties. The House of Steel, which features Superman and Wonder Woman, who are now married. The House of Thunder, which is the Marvel family, so like Mary Marvel and Billy Batson and everybody else like that. The Titans, the proper Justice League, and other groups. So what I've just laid out for you is that the world has now been overtaken. It's been run over by superheroes, and there is no longer, the human influence is diminished because superheroes now run stuff, and it's hurting the world. I'm not going to get any more today on what actually happens in the story, because that's what we're going to tell this over time. But I want to circle back and talk about Alan Moore's mentality and why this was going to exist. I'm going to read words from Alan Moore now.
Sean, before you read this,
yeah,
do we all have our psychic blockers on to prevent mind melting? Kale, did you put yours? Did you do it yours this morning?
I've actually turned mine off.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
I'm really looking for that right now.
Cool.
So
good, sounds good.
So this is Alan Moore on crossovers. Mind you, the actual document is very long. Like I said, 39 pages. And it actually starts in a funny way. Moore says, "I'm sure this is going to be an interminable ramble, as these things usually are." So yeah, it is very much that. But I've parsed through it to find the things that are, I think, most interesting and pertinent, and we'll go from there. Quote, "Firstly, as I see the commercial side, the perfect mass crossover will be something like the following. It would have a sensible and logical reason for crossing over with other titles, so that the readers who were prompted to try a new title as a result of the crossover, or vice versa, didn't feel cheated by some tenuous linkage of storylines that was at best spurious and at worst non-existent. It would provide a strong and resonant springboard from which to launch a number of new series, or with which to revitalize old ones again in a manner that was not obviously crassly exploitative so as to insult the reader's intelligence. With an eye to the merchandising that Marvel managed to spin out of Secret Wars, I think it's safe to assume that if it were possible to credibly spin role-playing games, toys, quote, waiting for Twilight, unquote, posters and t-shirts and badges and all the rest of that stuff from the title, then that would be a good idea. Ideally, it might even be possible, while appealing to the diehard superhero junkie, to produce a central story idea simple, powerful, and resonant enough to bear translation to other media. I mean, I know that I'm still probably intoxicated by the Watchmen deal, but it never hurts to allow for these things as a possibility, does it?"
Man, I love hearing Alan Moore, the capitalist.
Not just Alan Moore, the capitalist, Alan Moore, the optimist. At this point, Alan Moore is optimistic about his future with DC because Watchmen went so well.
Yeah.
This is 87.
yeah,
Watchmen was, we don't know exactly what month, but if it was earlier than October, Watchmen wasn't even done. And it was a hit on release. It's not like it became a hit later.
That Dark Knight came out the same year, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it kind of
Similar
revitalized
time frame,
what people thought comics were. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to me to read the words of a man who we now know as, bitter and jaded, being hopeful and optimistic about what could come next. I love that. Thought that was pretty cool.
And it's just weird hearing him talk about, like, oh, the marketing potential of these toys, and we can do like a waiting for Twilight thing. It's Alan Moore as Stan Lee, which is like mind-boggling now, with the history that's been there.
Well, I think also too, it's him selling it, to the higher ups.
And I'm sure, like, Secret Wars, the original one, did well, Even the toys, like, the toys are iconic, It's not even just the comics. Yeah.
Yeah.
So pitching this as a answer to that. Smart move.
Yeah. He went on to say, for one thing, crossovers require some very hard thinking about in advance if they're not going to generate more problems than they solve. And in thinking about something which will affect every book that the company publishes, if only in subtle ways, then one obviously has to be very careful. I shouldn't say that as yet, although I saw the outlines, I haven't read any of the Legends series or its crossovers, mainly by reason of not having got out to a comic shop recently. The premise, and pay close attention to this because this will sound familiar. The premise, if I understand it correctly, looked very good. It seemed to be attempting to give a sort of resonant mythic context to the DC pantheon while at the same time establishing a more rigorous social context for the assembled characters in terms of storytelling, thus drawing the whole DC continuity together into an interesting whole, which is exactly what it needs doing in the wake of the crisis. The more we can reinforce the idea of DC Universe as magical and concept in itself, assuming that those are our aims, then the more successful we'll be in keeping readers hooked upon that universe and on the books that chronicle its various phenomena. So what is he saying? Let's break it down. There was a book called DC Legends, and it was a weird, like, event crossover that didn't actually cross over with any books. It left the crossover open-ended in the sense that the books that were being published at the time and referenced by the Legends event didn't include any like major crossover stuff. They were still doing their own thing, but the Legends book managed to reference that. And it was a very different sort of idea. It was a 6-issue event, and the crossovers were like Batman at the time, Superman, Secret Origins, and it's sort of the first crossover after the crisis. And it launched several books and things like that. He's looking at this as a blueprint and a way to create a mythos and reestablish the mythic quality of these superheroes, which is what we were talking about earlier. Remember, I was saying DC's heroes are more monoliths unto themselves, and Marvel is more of a universal monolith. The Marvel universe is the draw, whereas for DC, it's the characters. Alan Moore is trying to change that, but he's also trying to establish, and this you'll understand this a little more, he's also trying to establish the DC characters as absolute and timeless. And it's very ambitious, and I can't wait to talk to you guys about how.
So I was looking into this Legends thing. I guess that's what launched Suicide Squad by Ostrander. Ostrander wrote this. Ostrander written and John Byrne drawn Legends, which that's a fucking team.
Yeah, Dan Trudeau says it launched the new Justice League, the Suicide Squad, and the Wonder Woman reboot, and it was the first appearance of Amanda Waller.
Yep.
Oh, the wall.
Exactly.
I mean, the one thing that jumped out to me too, Sean, that you mentioned is him wanting to kind of make these characters almost mythological, but also retain the social aspect to it, that it's social commentary on things, which just, that's Watchmen. That's Dr. Manhattan, versus, all the stuff that happens around Dr. Manhattan.
Exactly. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And the DNA of what Alan Moore thinks about superheroes and comics in general is all over this. It's all over this. And the other thing that I got out of this, especially from just reading the whole document, is that Alan Moore, maybe not the absolute biggest fan of Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Too wordy for him.
I think based on what he says, he has problems with what it did to DC overall and the universe. I'm going to go on. Of course, this approach isn't without its problems. If you don't do it right, if your assembled multitude of characters look merely banal, which I personally believe happened with Secret, then your entire continuity is cheapened in the long term, along with its credibility, whatever the short-term benefits in terms of sales might be. When this happens, your only recourse is to greater acts of debasement in order to attract reader attention, more deaths to appease the arena crowd element in the fan marketplace, eventually degenerating into a geek show. Crassness aside, is that not sort of what happened?
Greater acts of debasement.
Dude is calling what is still happening now, even the way he describes crossovers.
Right.
Oh yeah.
And what they should be is, and what they are now is what they shouldn't be still,
Yeah. And when I was reading through this stuff, I was tying it into what Dan Didio had said. Sort of like, we kept doing the same thing and we kept playing to the same audience. And in order to appease them, we had to keep doing more and more and more and more. Like, not more different stuff, more of the same stuff. And in my mind, more is outlining the dangers of that. So to continue, then there are the unintentional injuries in internal logic that can be unwittingly inflicted upon the mass continuity by such a venture, whatever the individual merits of the creators or their efforts, purely by the vast organizational problems that a project of this size seems to encounter. To explain that, I should perhaps look at a series that I have read, that being Marv and George's excellent Crisis on Infinite Earths. Although the motive was pure and the aim true with regard to Crisis, I can't help but feeling that somewhere along the line, in the attempt to consolidate and rationalize the DC cosmos, a situation even more potentially destabilizing and precarious was created. What he's talking about is the way that the Crisis eliminated the multiverse. Alan Moore felt that eliminated creativity and possibility, but he also felt that it annihilated and, to use his direct word, it unpeopled the characters who were lost in the Crisis. It did something worse than killing them. It removed them from the reality of the comics altogether.
Oh, like Earth 2 and stuff like that.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's true.
You saw that as a problem.
They just they don't exist anymore. They never had like an ending, Their story's gone. Yeah, I can see that. It feels a little dramatic, but I get it.
Well, but it even more than it takes away like an ending, it takes away context.
Exactly. That's exactly. He said, he talks so much about that. I don't want to read every word, but yeah, go ahead.
The idea of the multiverse is ingrained in the framework of the DC universe. Look at that iconic Flash cover. With the two Flashes running side by side. Like it's it's the identity. Oh boy, not Identity Crisis, Dan. We're not talking about that yet.
That's exactly what DC is, and I think Alan was trying to parse out how to get back to that. So moving forward, he said, I believe that one of the things that the comic fan is looking for, multi-title crossover epics, is some sense of a sanely ordered cosmos, not offered to him or her by the news headlines or the arguments of their parents over breakfast. That isn't to say that it's healthy or necessarily desirable to fulfill this fundamentally escapist sort of urge. I myself would feel uncomfortable if the imaginary reality I was offering my readers was intended as a pacifier rather than as something to make them think about their own reality. I'd cite Watchmen as an example of how it's possible to fulfill the requirements of a continuity much more strict and rigidly defined than is usual, while still making some sort of relevant point about the that the book readers are living in.
So even back in the late 80s, Alan Moore would have said "fuck you" to the people who said, "I don't want politics in my comics. I just want escapism."
Right. He believes that that's the death of story.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Like, he's saying, "Hey, we can have our cake, but we gotta put some nutrients in there. We gotta put some." We got to put the vitamins in there that we need.
It sounds like a disgusting cake.
It probably is.
Maybe well, smoothie is more apropos.
Yeah, it's that same way of whether you like it or not, like McDonald's is all sugar, but if you need a meal, you can eat it and it will fill you,
Right. Exactly.
If you read nothing but comic books, you'll get something out of it.
And Moore doesn't want to serve McDonald's.
Right.
Moore understands your need for McDonald's as an unconscious lack of care for your life and a desire to escape and not address your life. Moore wants to force you to look at it and evaluate it.
Moore wants you eating a Big Mac while watching Super Size Me.
Well, good. he wants to make Red Robin the restaurant.
Is that any better?
Yum.
The
That's
McDonald's,
right?
I mean, marginally.
So he says, attendant to this, there are a number of people in the industry who feel that it's time on the continuity and try to get rid of a lot of the rather anal and obsessive attitudes that have been allowed to dominate the marketplace and to some degree have hindered it in its periodic attempts to be taken seriously. And now we get into his reasoning for doing this. And what I believe is probably, alongside Watchmen and Crisis, the primary reason why Alan Moore wanted to make this comic. Here we go. I suppose a shining example of this would be Frank's Dark Knight, which, while it doesn't seem bothered about fitting into any graven in stone continuity, does service to the legend of Batman and brilliantly redefines the character for an 80s audience, and nobody really seems to care how much this all fits into the continuity because it's such a bloody good story. Will Jason Todd really die? Will all the superheroes leave Earth to Superman and his government pals? Will Oliver Queen really get his arm burned off at the elbow in a fight with Clark and become an embittered urban terrorist? Who cares? He's saying that what the Dark Knight did for Batman was that it established a framework by which every creator who comes after Frank Miller can look at and say, okay, this is who Batman is. This is where Batman ends up. This is the end of the line. This is the myth of Batman. How do we reach that point? That's up to us. But this is the framework. And everybody knows it because this is the hottest thing in comics. So if you care about Batman comics in the 80s, you know this story. So when something happens in the current Batman that makes you think about that, you go, oh, wow, there's that connective tissue, but it doesn't disrupt it if you've never read that. You're not disrupted by a lack of having read The Dark Knight because you're letting the future inform the past, which is the exact opposite way that comics operate.
But it's also funny because he's also saying here, too, that if it's a good story, the what's around it doesn't matter because people are enjoying it for it being a good story in and of itself.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
This so it's forward thinking and continuity as opposed to the previous past thinking. And stop me if I'm getting to where you're going, Sean, but this sounds a lot like Future State.
Okay.
You know, like they were planning, or not Future State, but 5G in a way.
5G, yes.
Yeah. You know, planning the future and how we get there is the fun part. Maybe in a much more condensed timeline, which might have been what the problem with it was, but
and drawing to a close the story of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
The human, the personal identity of those characters, not the myth of them, not the cape and cowl, not the thing that sells tickets, but the human part of those characters, which I can see the argument of, especially in context of what Alan Moore is talking about, because if I could use an example like Thor is, and I'm talking about like the abstract Thor, not Marvel's Thor. Thor is a character that has existed in human history for a really, really, really long time. And to the point where lots of people have a different idea about the minutia of Thor. Maybe your Thor is the Marvel Thor, but maybe your Thor is God of War Thor. Maybe your Thor is the more classic iteration of Thor. They're all Thor, and they all have the general hallmarks of what Thor is, but they're slightly different. The same way that Batman can be different to everybody, but there are still the core tenets of what makes a Batman story. That doesn't necessarily require it to be Bruce Wayne or even the Bruce Wayne that you know. It only requires it to meet the qualifications of what Batman is, which we all know, and that the Dark Knight gave a clear foundation. That is why Alan Moore is so obsessed with the Dark Knight.
I'm trying to think of like modern, I guess, examples of this being done right. And the first thing that keeps jumping in my mind is Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow by Tom King. You know, Dan even in the chat brings up, you know, Tom King owes a lot to this thinking. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow is a very definitive, out of time Supergirl story. That its goal is to tell a good Supergirl story, context of what the comics are, be damned. And it could exist anywhere, really. And honestly, and like, they're making a fucking movie out of it. So it's doing something right there.
I tend to, I think I've always sort of followed this logic to a degree. I like to, especially with like Batman, I like to sort of make my own timeline as things come along. Like, you know, at a certain point, Hush and Batman Fugitive and Batman War Games all happen in one Bruce Wayne lifetime. But then at a certain point, it stops. You know, that version of Bruce Wayne is mine, but it's nobody else's. And it can keep going for other people.
Right. Like you have your own headcanon, I guess.
Yeah, headcanon, yeah.
It's funny when you bring it up. I don't think of DC in continuity, honestly. Like Marvel, I'm very strict on Marvel continuity in my mind. Like that is linear. With DC, it's like, no, these are stories in my head.
I think I don't know if that's how DC has trained its audience to think, though.
Fair. And it could just be how I got into comics too with DC.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I got in, I got into Hush. I read Morrison's Batman. I was very cherry picky with getting into DC. So like that maybe dictates the puzzle in my head that is DC.
Yeah.
I also think Marvel works a lot harder to maintain their timeline.
Sure.
With the sliding time scale being almost atomic at this point. Dan Trudeau points out on Twitch that the universe is the foundation, not the characters.
Right, exactly. The myth of Marvel is the universe. The myth of DC is the characters. It's no surprise that Marvel does have to have a sliding scale because almost all of Marvel's characters' origins are rooted in a certain time.
Yep.
Whereas for DC, they're not. Superman's ship could have crash landed in any year. Doesn't even matter. That's why they can put it in Russia in Superman Red Sun. It doesn't matter where he landed.
Yeah.
Batman's parents could die watching Zorro, or they could die watching House Party. Matter what the movie was. Like it doesn't matter.
I want to see that book. Yeah. it's a Batman dies at a screening of Friday.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fucking Shrek.
Hey now. You're an all-star.
I wanted to go over at least one more quote from Alan Moore because I think it underscores what we're talking about right now. And I love it so much because we forget that these people are geniuses. We forget that these people are magicians. And we forget how much they understand this stuff that we consume so readily and easily. So Moore said the following. And again, this is how we understand his mentality. Quote, as I mentioned in my introduction to Frank's Dark Knight, one of the things that prevents superhero stories from ever attaining the status of true modern myths of legends is that they are open-ended. An essential quality of a legend is that the events in it are clearly defined in time. Robin Hood is driven to become an outlaw by the injustices of King John and his minions. That is his origin. He meets Little John, Friar Tuck, and all the rest, and forms the Merry Men. He wins the tournament in disguise. He falls in love with Maid Marian and thwarts the Sheriff of Nottingham. That is his career, including his love interest, major villains, and the formation of a superhero group that he is a part of. He lives to see the return of good King Richard and is finally killed by a woman, firing the last arrow to mark the place where he shall be buried. That is his resolution. You can apply the same paradigm to King Arthur Davy Crockett, or Sherlock Holmes with equal success. You cannot apply it to most comic book characters because, in order to meet the commercial demands of continuing series, they can never have a resolution. Indeed, they find it difficult to embrace any of the changes in life that the passage of time brings about for these very same reasons, making them finally less than fully human, as well as falling far short of the true myth. Pause. Where are we at with Spider-Man comics today?
Mary Jane is just his friend now.
Worse, his sister.
Spider-Man is stuck.
Yep.
We've seen it all.
Yep.
What happened between Spider-Man's origin and now that informs his end?
But you know where
we don't know because he doesn't have an end.
Ultimates
we don't know the ending.
Ultimates did, and then Miles came about, and it worked. You know, like
So that's wild. This is exactly what I've been saying since day one of our podcast, and I've never been able to put my finger on why. And this is exactly it.
I think now your beard's going to start growing even faster now, Kel, because of this.
Yeah,
the mental link has been established. You're closest to him too, so the side effects are going to be greater.
Invest in hair ties.
So what it sounds like he's advocating for is Elseworlds. Elseworlds as the proper way of telling a story in a way, right?
Even just evolution.
Sure. Yeah.
I guess my interpretation is he's trying to provide a framework for how at least DC can have their cake and eat it too. How DC can provide the Dark Knight Returns of basically how the whole entire DC universe can get the Dark Knight Returns treatment. That is exactly what Twilight of the Gods is. And as we get deeper into this proposal over the coming weeks, you're going to understand exactly how I mean that. I'm not even saying that the proposal's good. I actually don't think DC would have ever published it. But I think that it's fascinating despite that, because it could have been reworked and it could have been made into something that would have been palatable for DC. The ask on Alan Moore's part is tremendous.
Sure.
Absolutely gargantuan. I shudder to even give you a hint, but I will give you one because I need you to understand how different this is. There is a storyline here, a piece of this proposal that is not very different from something that Jeff Loeb did in Ultimates 3 that involves Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch that everybody knows about.
Incest.
He goes far. He goes far.
Oh.
Yeah. It's a heavy book. It's a dark book. It's Alan Moore pulling no punches. I'm saying book. It's a proposal. The book never actually got released. But
I got a question.
Yeah.
With the proposal, does DC still have the rights of the proposal, and can they make this book?
Man, oh man, there is so much to talk about.
Okay, all right.
That's a huge part of it. Remember, I said this proposal was a battleground for Alan Moore and DC after 89, after he left.
Huh.
Because this story is so much bigger than you realize.
This could have been Watchmen 2.
Yeah. Oh, Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah.
This makes me really want, and it's antithetical to Alan Moore, but like an Alan Moore biopic, you know?
Sure.
Just a creative man driven into being a jaded mess because of big business in a way.
Mm-hmm.
There's my screenplay I get to write. Here we go.
Get started. Dan says that's not what the Dark Knight was. It wasn't an ending in the future. It's an end to an older version of the character. Okay, so let's say that the language that we're using isn't appropriate. I'll reframe it.
Well, he was actually responding directly to C.W. Gordon, who said it sounds awfully like Zack Snyder's DC.
But I thought Dan had made that comment earlier that
he did. It's an ending for the Silver Age Batman set in the 80s.
Right. Let's put ourselves in the 80s. Okay?
Because this is right here. Wait.
This is from the 80s, so let's get rid of our 2023 brains for a moment.
Gladly.
A story that shows Batman in the future, or Batman's ending, an older, grizzled Bruce Wayne, an older Superman, all these characters being aged, would be perceived by someone at that time as a future story for Batman. That's the perception. Reality or otherwise is really not relevant. What Alan Moore is trying to get at is that this is a definitive close for the Batman character. That's what he's trying to get at. And that it establishes a baseline from which future creators can work backwards from. Not that you even have to acknowledge it in any way. You shouldn't necessarily tease it out. But if you're lost, if you're like, well, what are the core tenets of Batman? Or what are the core tenets of this one and that one? Where do they go so that I know where they are, where they need to be? This is the point of reference.
Like, in case of emergency, introduce the mutants.
So that's kind of the idea. And being able to apply that across the board for all of DC. Which sounds like an impossible deal.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you this. Regardless of what you think about what we're going to talk about in the future regarding how this shakes out, I think Alan Moore's plan was extremely ambitious and interesting, and it might have worked. It might have worked. I don't think DC would have allowed it to be published this way, but if they did, it might have worked. It's possible. So I think this is a good place to say pause on this story. It's fascinating. I can't wait to dive in further. In the coming weeks, we will be reading more from Alan's own words and parsing it out and, giving you guys our take on what this could have been. Let us know what you guys think. What do you think about Twilight of the Superheroes so far? What do you think about our coverage of it? Is this something that you're into?
I will say, event name, that could have been punched up.
I guess. I think it has a when you hear it, it sounds familiar already.
I think
it's
so,
always
maybe because of where I am in time. Sure, okay.
And Twilight of the Gods is a real thing that he was playing off of. And when you hear what the Twilight of the Superhero story was, it's definitely the Ragnarok of DC Comics. Like,
it had quippy dialogue and Mark Ruffalo?
Not that Ragnarok.
Oh, okay. All right, got it.
Not that one. Not that one. So yeah, let us know your thoughts about this coverage. Do you want to hear more about the Twilight of the Superheroes? I love doing stuff like this. I get a lot of joy out of, trying to piece together all this different kind of stuff. So let us know what you think about it.
I want to hear about it. So we'll be doing it next week.
Yeah. Man, if Kale's excited for an episode.
I know, right? That's always encouraging.
Sean's been fucking killing it. The 5G files, what did we do last week? The Dan Didio thing? Fucking come on.
Thanks. I appreciate that, dude.